Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello, you are listening to Czechast, the podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka. It's summer, that so-called silly season, when at least in theory nothing much is happening. Normally this is the time when journalists like me just dust off lighter stories about escaped zoo animals or record-breaking cucumbers. But this year is different, at least in Czechia. The pre-election campaign for the parliament is already heating up, and internationally crucial decisions are being made about support for Ukraine and what happens in the Middle East. Still, between these serious developments, I can't help but notice that familiar refrain that times aren't what they used to be and that we are living through something entirely new. It's a thought that sent me rummaging not through today's headlines, but into the pages of short story written almost a century ago by Karel Čapek, arguably the most famous Czech writer of the 20th century. He published On the Decline of the Times in the early 1930s. It was one of several short pieces he wrote in the 1920s and early 1930s that were later brought together in a collection called Apocryphal Tales. So if you'd like to look it up, that's where you'll find it. For me, reading it today is like hearing a witty, slightly grumpy relative at a family gathering. Only this one happens to be a caveman. I decided to translate the story into English myself for Czechast and share it with you in this episode. We'll start with the story and then follow with a report by my colleague Anna Fodor, which I also worked on a little bit, about Karel Čapek's life and work. So we start with an apocryphal tale on the decline of the times.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
In front of the cave there was silence. The men had left early in the morning, waving their spears in the direction of Blansko or Rájec, where a herd of reindeer had been tracked. The women were gathering cranberries in the forest, and only occasionally could their shrill shouting and chattering be heard. The children were most likely splashing around in the stream down below. After all, who could keep an eye on those little brats, that unruly bunch? And so old caveman Janeček dozed off in that rare quiet moment under the gentle October sun. To be honest, he was snoring and his nose whistled, but he pretended he wasn't sleeping. Rather, he acted as though he were guarding the tribe's cave and ruling over it as befits an old chieftain. Old Mrs. Janeček had laid out a fresh bear hide and was scraping it with a sharp flint. That had to be done thoroughly, inch by inch, not like the young one does it, she thought. That chit just gives it a half-hearted once-over and then runs off to cuddle and mess around with the kids. Such hides, the old woman thought, don't last. They get stiff or start to rot. But I won't meddle in her affairs, thought Mrs. Janečková, unless her husband tells her. Truth to be told, the young one doesn't know how to conserve anything. And here, look at this hole, right in the middle of the back. Dear me, the old woman bristled. Who in the world jabbed that bear in the back? That ruins the whole hide. My man would never have done that, she thought bitterly. He always aimed for the neck. "Ah, yeah," grunted old Janeček just then, rubbing his eyes. "They're not back yet." "Of course not," grumbled his wife. "You'll have to wait." "Pshaw," sighed the old man, blinking sleepily. "Of course not. And where are the women?" "Am I supposed to keep a watch over them?" the old woman snapped. "They're off, wandering somewhere." "Ah, yeah," yawned Grandpa Janeček. "Wandering off, instead of doing this or that. So it goes. What a mess." There was silence again. Only Mrs. Janeček scraped the rawhide quickly and with angry fervor. "I'm telling you," Janeček said, scratching his back thoughtfully, "you'll see they'll come back empty-handed again. It's obvious, with their worthless bone spears. And I keep telling my son, listen, no bone is hard or strong enough to make a proper spear. You have to admit that, even as a woman, neither bone nor antler has the kind of, penetration, right? You hit bone and it won't pierce it, right? It's just common sense. Now a stone spearhead, that's a tool. Sure, it takes more work, but it's a real weapon, by God. And do you think my son listens?" "Of course not," said Mrs. Janeček bitterly. "Nobody listens to advice nowadays." "I'm not ordering anyone around," the old man protested. "But they won't even take advice. Yesterday I found a really nice flat flint shard under the cliff over there. Just needed a bit of chipping around the edges to sharpen it, and it would have made a great spearhead. So I bring it home and show my son. Look, this is a proper stone, eh? It is, he says. But what's it for, Dad? Well, I say, it could be worked into a spearhead. Oh, come on, Dad, he says. Who has time to chip and fuss with that? We've got piles of that old junk in the cave, and it's no good for anything. Won't even stay on the shaft, no matter how you tie it. So, what's the point? Lazy bums, shouted the old man suddenly. Nobody wants to work a decent piece of flint properly anymore. That's the problem. They want everything easy. Sure, a bone spear's head's ready in a flash, but it breaks all the time too, and they say it doesn't matter, just make a new one. Right, but where does that get you? A new spear every 5 minutes? Tell me, have you ever heard such nonsense? A good flint head used to last for years. But mark my words, they'll come crawling back to our honest old stone weapons one day. That's why I keep everything I find, old arrows and clubs and flint knives, and they call that junk. The old man nearly choked on his sorrow and indignation. You see, said Mrs. Janečková, trying to change the subject, it's just like with the hides. Mama, the young one says to me, why bother scraping it so much? It's not worth the work. Try tanning it with ash for once. It doesn't even stink. You are going to teach me? She snapped at her absent daughter-in-law. I know what I know. Hides have always just been scraped, and what hides they were. Of course, if you think the work's not worth it, that's all they care about, finding some way to avoid the work. That's why they keep coming up with new methods and gimmicks, tanning hides with ash. Whoever heard such a thing? That's just how it is, yawned Janeček. What we used to do isn't good enough for them anymore, and now they say stone weapons are uncomfortable to hold. Well, that's true. We never cared much about comfort, but nowadays, heavens, wouldn't want them to get blisters on their little hands. Tell me where it's all going to lead. Just look at today's kids. Let them play, Grandpa, says my daughter-in-law. Yeah, but what are they going to grow into? If they didn't make such a racket, complained old Mrs. Janeček. They are downright unruly, that's the truth. That's the modern upbringing for you, preached old Janeček. And whenever I say anything to my son, he tells me, Dad, you just don't understand. Things are different now. It's a different era. And apparently, even those bone weapons aren't the final word. One day, he says, people will come up with an even newer kind of material. Now, listen, that's where I draw the line. Who's ever seen a solid material other than stone, wood, or bone? You have to admit that, even as a silly woman, that this just crosses all limits. Mrs. Janeček let her hands fall into her lap. What do you think? She said. Where do they get all this nonsense? Well, apparently it's modern, mumbled the old man toothlessly. Over that way, about 4 days' journey from here, some new tribe arrived, some foreign rebel, and they say that's how they do things. Just so you know, all these stupid ideas come from them. The bone weapons and all of it. They even, and get this, they even buy that stuff from them, he cried, outraged. For our good furs, as if anything good ever came from foreigners. You should never trust any of foreign riffraff. That's a lesson from our ancestors. Every stranger should be attacked on sight and finished off. That's how it's always been. No fussing around. Just strike and be done with it. But no. Dad, says my son, things are different now. We are moving toward exchange of goods. Exchange of goods? When I kill someone and take his things, I get his goods and I give him nothing. So why bother with some kind of exchange? That's the point, Dad, says my son. You're paying in human lives, and those are too precious. And there you have it. Now they say human lives are too precious. These are opinions people have today, muttered the old man in disgust. Cowards, the lot of them. Lives are too precious. And tell me, how are all these people supposed to make a living if we stop fighting and killing each other? Even now there aren't enough reindeer to go around. Look at them, they mourn human lives, but have no respect for tradition, no reverence for their ancestors or their parents. It's disgraceful, burst out Grandpa Janeček. Just the other day, I saw one snot-nosed little brat scribbling with ochre on the cave wall, drawing a bison. I cuffed him, but my son says, "Leave him be, Dad. That bison looks almost real." Well, that's the last straw. Since when do we waste time on such nonsense? If you've got nothing to do, boy, go chip a flint, but don't draw bison on the walls. Who knows? It might even spook the hunters. Why do we need such foolishness? Mrs. Janečková pressed her lips into a firm line. If only it were just bison, she said after a while. What then? Asked Grandpa. Oh, nothing. She hesitated. I'm embarrassed to even say, but just so you know, she declared suddenly, this morning I found in the cave a piece of mammoth tusk. It had been carved into a naked woman, breasts and everything, you know. You don't say, the old man gasped. And who carved it? Mrs. Janečková shrugged indignantly. Who knows? probably one of the youngsters. I threw it in the fire, but it had such breasts. Ah! Well, it's just too much, groaned Grandpa Janeček. That's perversion, pure and simple. See, that's what comes of carving every damn thing out of bone. Such obscenity never even crossed our minds, because you couldn't make that sort of thing from flint anyway. That's where it leads. These inventions of theirs, always inventing, always introducing something new until they ruin and destroy everything. And I say, it won't last much longer. And this short story by Karel Čapek was published by Lidové noviny newspaper on the 24th of December, Christmas Eve of 1931, nearly 100 years ago.
Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
So, that was On the Decline of the Times by Karel Čapek. And now to learn more about the man behind the story, known for introducing the word robot to the world and beloved in his home country, here is a report by my colleague Anna Fodor. It's about Karel Čapek's life, his work and the places in Czechia that shaped him.
Karel Čapek was born the youngest of 3 children in the village of Malé Svatlanovice in 1890, only a few kilometers from the Polish border. Zdeněk Vacek, the director of the Čapek Memorial in Stará Huť near Dobříš in the central Bohemian region, formerly the Čapek family's summer residence where the writer spent much of the last 3 years of his life, says that Čapek's childhood was very much shaped by growing up in the foothills of the Bohemian mountains.
Dá se říct, že dětství nebo vůbec celý život.
I think it's fair to say that Karel Čapek's childhood and even the rest of his life is most connected with today's Hradec Králové region, then to a lesser extent with Prague, and in the later years of his life, the central Bohemian region. But the Hradec Králové region is what connects him with his brother, the painter and writer Josef Čapek, and his sister Helena Čapková, because that's where they were all born.
Královéhradecký, protože se tam narodili.
Karel Čapek's father, Antonín, was a local doctor and would travel through the mountainous terrain visiting patients, sometimes on foot, sometimes in a horse-drawn carriage. His father's work made a great impression on the young Karel as a child, an impression that was carried over into his adult life and influenced his writing.
Právě to, že děti svého tatínka často doprovázeli třeba.
The children often accompanied their father from one village to another as he went to visit patients on his rounds. Karel saw how people looked up to his father, how they respected him because of his profession. He also saw how his father was sometimes able to miraculously save people, and how sometimes it wasn't possible to help them anymore, and he would instead help them to come to terms with death. In waiting rooms in doctors' offices at the time, there were very often real skeletons as a kind of memento mori. That was all very important for Čapek, and he said many times later in his life that if any profession really influenced him, then it was the medical profession. It can be seen of many of his works, like The White Plague, for example.
Poslání, odráželo se to potom v řadě děl, Bílá nemoc a tak dál a tak dál.
Malé Svatlanovice was and still is a spa town, but it also had a functioning coal mine, so Antonín Čapek's patients were from all walks of life, not only spa visitors and locals, but also miners. As an interesting aside, Vacek mentions that he thinks the current Czech president Petr Pavel's grandfather was himself a miner in Malé Svatlanovice. Other towns in the Hradec Králové region were also important for the young Karel Čapek. He was christened and went to primary school in Úpice and spent holidays with his siblings and grandparents in Hronov. He later moved with his grandmother to Hradec Králové, the region's namesake and largest city, so he could go to grammar school there.
Se traduje, že byl z hradeckého gymnázia vyloučen, ono to není tak úplně.
It's said that he was expelled from the school, but that's not quite true. He wasn't expelled, he was an excellent student. But it was during the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he was part of an underground student group. Not exactly a resistance group against Austria-Hungary, but kind of a progressive discussion group. So the management recommended that he go to a different school. So he finished his secondary school education outside the Hradec Králové region in Brno.
Mimo území Královéhradeckého kraje dnešního v Brně.
Nowadays, Čapek is perhaps best known for his science fiction works, including his 1936 novel War with the Newts and his 1920 play RUR, standing for Rossum's Universal Robots, which introduced the word robot into Czech and from there to many other languages. Although ever humble and ever honest, Čapek publicly named his brother, the painter and poet Josef Čapek, as its actual inventor. But he was a remarkably versatile writer. As well as plays, fairy tales and novels, he also penned newspaper articles and political and philosophical essays. He was a notable and vocal opponent of both fascism and communism, and clearly elucidated his reasons for being so in a newspaper article simply titled Why I Am Not a Communist.
Vzniklo to tak, že mezi nimi, mezi i Čapkovými přáteli.
The article came out because Čapek and his friends, who were more left-leaning than right-leaning politically, were of the mind that although social justice was certainly desirable, Bolshevism, with all the violence and Marxist ideology that brought with it, was certainly not. But because many of their friends passionately defended communism, they decided they should also formulate and make public their reasons for not being communists. In his article, Čapek said that the violence the communists used as a matter of course and the way they presented themselves as acting in the best interests of all, while in reality running a totalitarian dictatorship, made him certain that communism was something he absolutely did not want. It was precisely because he wanted to help people and to achieve social justice that he could not be a communist.
Čapek was above all a democrat and a humanist. He believed that democracy is worth fighting for, that totalitarian regimes should be opposed, and that we have a moral obligation to help those fleeing them. He lived to see the Sudetenland taken over by the Nazis, but died a few months before the full invasion of Czechoslovakia, so, perhaps mercifully, he didn't live to see the ravages that the two political ideologies he most fervently opposed, fascism and later communism, wrought on his country. Although greatly saddened by the 1938 Munich Agreement, Vacek says his reaction to it is a perfect exemplar of his belief that one should remain rational and compassionate towards others, even in moments when nationalist passions are running high, and of his own ability to practice what he preached.
Po Mnichovu 1938, která se dala interpretovat.
Many in Czechoslovakia saw the Munich Agreement as a betrayal by Britain and France. But Čapek, although upset and crushed by the incident, wrote an article where he said it was politicians that did this, not ordinary people. It went something like, "When I think of Britain, I think of that little house in Kent. When I think of France, I see this and that, and I remember such and such person. When I think of Italy, I remember how I traveled by train and a laborer sat on the seat opposite me and offered me some cheese. When I think of Germany, I don't think of Hitler. I think of the small pub where I drank and chatted with the locals." It's incredible that in such a situation, Čapek managed to remain so generous and broad-minded, and his humanity and love for people and commitment to objectivity remained. There was something that was said about Masaryk when he died, but I think it also applies to Karel Čapek, that he managed to be a patriot without being a chauvinist. They don't have to be the same thing. You can be a patriot without hating other nations and people.
Given his clear and forthright rejection of communism, it's hardly surprising that Čapek's work was subject to strict censorship under the Czechoslovak communist regime. However, it wasn't the case that his work was banned entirely, says Vacek.
Čapek byl upozaděn, řekněme, nevěděli si moc s ním rady.
Čapek was pushed into the background by the communist regime at first, but then at the start of the 1950s, an academic from the Soviet Union published a book about him, and of course, his supporters here took advantage of that. They used it as a kind of springboard to say, well, if Karel Čapek is acknowledged and admired in the Soviet Union, which we supposedly model ourselves on, then nobody here has the right to ban him. So that was a way to kind of bring Čapek back. But in the same way that the communists appropriated Jan Hus and Masaryk by saying things like, if Jan Hus were alive now, he would be a communist, they also tried to claim Karel Čapek as one of their own. So his work was published, but it was subject to strict censorship. It was clear what could be published and what couldn't. His anti-fascist works, fairy tales, things which either didn't touch on politics or which could be interpreted as being consistent with communist ideology, those were allowed, and the others were suppressed.
Jiné byly vlastně potlačeny.
Although Čapek was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 7 times between 1932 and his death in 1938, he never won. But his legacy still lives on today, with his plays still being performed, his books still being read, and the word robot being used now more than ever. Vacek says that not only did Čapek introduce the word robot to the world, He also had surprising foresight about the way in which robots would be created.
Jeho roboti, ty umělé bytosti.
His robots were created in the way that robots will likely be created in the future. Not like some monster, a Frankenstein or a golem, that will only follow commands from its creator, but mass-produced in factories so that everyone will be able to afford them, just like everyone can afford a mobile phone nowadays. Ordinary people in the future will be able to afford a robot that will save them toil and drudgery. In fact, since we have mobile phones nowadays that contain free apps with a million different functions, navigation, translation, bank transfers, whatever we might think of, we might even say that these free or cheap artificial beings that help us and save us work are in some sense already a reality.
To se vlastně nějakým způsobem uskutečňuje.
And that's Czechast for today. We heard On the Decline of the Times by Karel Čapek, followed by a closer look at his life and literary legacy. I find his humor and insight refreshing, especially in the summertime, and a useful reminder that our worries about unprecedented times, often eco-concerns voiced decades, even centuries ago, or perhaps as old as humankind itself. And since this is Czechast, I thought it would be interesting to remember that Czech thinkers and writers like Karel Čapek were reflecting on exactly the same things 100 years back. You can find this and other episodes of Czechast wherever you get your podcasts or on our website at radio.cz. While you are there, check out our sister podcast, Prague Off the Beaten Track, where we explore hidden corners of the Czech capital. I'm Vít Pohanka, thanks for listening and enjoy the rest of your summer.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.